So good morning, everyone. I am Ylva Rouse. I'm the senior curator at MOCA, for those of you who don't know me. And today it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Rina Banerjee, our current Project Atrium artist. And she's waving, so you can identify her with those wonderful glasses.
They're a little reflective, so I'm sorry about that. I'll try to not have it shine on you.
So this is our first virtual coffee with a curator, so it's a very exciting. I hope you all have your cup of coffee. We don't have our wonderful pastries that we usually have, but if everyone is comfortable and all of your speakers work, Rina and I will talk a little bit, and then we'll have a Q&A. So you will have a chance to talk with Rina.
Excuse me, Ylva.
Yeah.
Will you choose the individuals who would like to ask the questions so we don't all open our microphones at the same time? Yeah.
Yeah. So Matthew, you have two ways of doing it. One is through the chat. If everybody knows how to use that function, it's called chat, and it's in the bottom band. And there you can input your questions, and Matthew will kind of guide the conversation. Or if you are familiar with chat or not comfortable, just raise your hand and we will take you in the order. All right. Yeah. Okay. So a little bit about Rina. She was born 1963 to a Bengali family in Calcutta, or as you say today, Kolkata, in India. She grew up in London and also later in New York, where she still lives and works, and where she's talking to us today from. After receiving a BS in Polymer Engineering, Banerjee went on to complete an M.F.A. in painting and printmaking at Yale University, graduating in 1995. She's exhibited widely, both nationally and internationally. She's very well known in Europe and in the East, and here in the US. A current large retrospective is traveling through. It began at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, PAFA, in Philadelphia, went on to San Jose Museum of Art, then the Fowler at UCLA, and currently it's at Frist Art Museum in Nashville. It will end when it can move at National Museum of Art at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. For MOCA, Rina proposed a site-specific installation for our Project Atrium space based on the ancient myth of the goddess Sita. And we'll talk much more about it further on. It has as protagonist the goddess herself, Sita, the sacred monkey Hanuman, and Mother Earth as protagonists. And we'll go into that in a minute, but I wanted to begin a little bit staying with your bio, Rina, if that's okay, since you maintain a very close relationship with your alma mater, Yale. And I know, for example, that you will be the keynote speaker for the opening of their British Art Center, which is a great honor. And perhaps you can speak a little bit about that.
Yes. It's been a very interesting time at Yale because Yale is celebrating 150 years of women at Yale University, making it 50 years for the Yale School of Art. And it has a very specific history and relationship to women that have been developing since I graduated in 1995, when it was a time when we had the first female faculty that would get tenure. And so the Yale I graduated from has changed so dramatically in my lifetime that it really demanded a celebration for the changes that took place and is still taking place at Yale, one of which we have the first female dean of our school this year. And I think all these kinds of things prompted for us to really consider a year-long celebration, which would include the British Arts Center with its new director, Courtney Martin, to present contemporary art, as well as the Yale Art Gallery, which is located across the street from the British Arts Center, as two museums that present what Yale has been doing for and with women over these 150 years. So that's how I'm involved as speaker for the British Arts Center, as they're going into an exhibition called Art in Focus, which focuses on women artists from Yale, and also another sister exhibition at the Yale Art Gallery as well that is developed, that celebrates 80 artists who all graduated from Yale, either in the M.F.A, B.F.A, or Yale University.
That's wonderful. And you also teach there, right? I was curious to know how you find your students. Are they very different from our generation? You have said that the whole experience is very different.
Yeah,
are they more knowledgeable about the world, do you think?
Well, definitely what has changed is their openness to contemporary art. I went to school in 1995, where still the aesthetics that were preferred and dominant in any conversation had to lead back to abstract expressionism, minimalism, and even conceptual art was not welcomed. And was considered very provocative and difficult to talk about. And there was kind of anti-intellectual side to Yale, ironically, considering it's a university, which I thoroughly enjoyed. And that's changed. The students in their studio practice, from what I've experienced as a critic, I'm not a Yale faculty. I am a critic for the semester, and hopefully it will continue. But I've really taken a lot of pride and joy in learning from them about how the demographics have also changed of who the students are. During my period, there were 25 students or 19 students thereabout for each incoming year for the M.F.A. And the quota system in place during my time allowed for one Asian and one African American person and one foreigner. The foreigner students, or foreign students that they were called at the time, was indefinitely from Europe.
Yeah.
And the one African American from the US, of course, and the Asian slot would alternate between East Asian and South Asian so every other year. And my most memorable recollection is my faculty saying, Rina, I don't know what to say about your work. I think I remember we had a South Asian student 10 years ago, And this is what we said. And so there was a kind of clumsiness that attributed to the lack of proximity to certain communities.
Yeah.
That now at Yale, every faculty, every student is responsible for the whole world, knowing what's happening in different locations, different demographics. Nothing can be neglected. It's huge
Or isolated.
responsibility.
Yeah. Yeah. I was curious, both in relation to your work, obviously, but also in relation to what we're going through right now with the pandemic, because your work is so incredibly relevant to the moment with immigration, contamination, pollination, commerce, human action, power versus nature, things like that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What I wanted to ask you is, why did you switch from engineering to art? And if there's a special, was there a special moment there?
Well, I mean, as we all understand, really, when I started with engineering, I had this attraction for how science was about the world, this huge place. And when you're an immigrant, especially, you can participate because it doesn't matter where you're from. It is such a large thing, and therefore has all kinds of possibilities and conversations that allow you to participate. I think intuitively, I felt that was true about art as well, but it hadn't happened at that time in the 80s. Art wasn't an international thing, and taking art history courses at my engineering school, Case Western Reserve University.
Case Western in engineering.
Yeah, so it's a very, prominent engineering school. But we fortunately had a music program across the street, as well as an art school. So I was exposed to those.
Yeah, they sure do.
Yeah. So it was a unique situation where it really opened my mind, even though I'm from New York City, really opened my mind to those kinds of analogies between the two. And I thought there's so much we should be doing with art as I visited the museum in Cleveland.
Yeah.
Because we do have a language that we all share that is visual first. If you think of a baby that is born, the first thing that they grab is what they see. And so seeing is a language in itself that we should all know it to be not only culturally specific, but easy to exchange. And I thought it would be a very important role that I could play in realizing that we don't have to only in this complete polar situation, like the culture of our origin and like be invested in the culture of the US. That it can be multiple places, which I actually loved and enjoyed growing up in New York City with all its neighborhoods and the diversity of cultures that I participated in every day.
So the sense of being in the world was always at the center of your art practice. So in essence, the difference wasn't so big between going from science to art. And that has to do also with the way you work. You have a very technical part where you work with a fabricator to create those constructions, but there's also this component, what you have sometimes referred to as the low-tech handiwork, which perhaps came from necessity in the beginning, from your small studio and so on.
You can see that her engineering background, can't you?
Absolutely. But then you also have this.
Which is interesting because Preston Haskell is an engineer.
Yes, exactly. He understands Rina's work in that way, no? But at the same time, there's also this other component where it's you work in a time element during the making of the work, where you put layers of objects and all the sewing and so on and so forth. It's something we associate with an old artisan mode of working, right? Where every object is unique and the gestures become important. But you've also said that you like working that way because it makes the work more accessible. So can you speak a little bit about this, about your process?
Yeah, I think I've always described it as low tech because I want to bring to the forefront that, one, anyone can do what I'm doing in some sense, which is the pleasure of seeing something done so uniquely. Is like, I could have done that, but I didn't do that. And so the human expression is really about this idea of selection, which has become very mainstream in art commerce, that in some sense, the whole commerce of exchange has to do with having choices, lots of choices. Even if you go to a store, you want to see 12 shampoos, you know? So I love the idea that I could increase the number of choices of things, have it presented in the sculpture itself as something that is familiar and not mysteriously made by the artist. And so it creates a kind of intimacy between the viewer and the artist to say, I'm going to just tie this here, you know? And I think that has, for me, has to do with the pride that American identity takes in simplicity, that it is about this way of doing it and being self-sufficient. I came from a South Asian culture from Calcutta, where you'd have 1 million people in your homes, not literally, but in a way helping their either servants or so on. So one of the things that I really embraced in American culture was this idea of independence and self-sufficiency. And I didn't want to learn these great tools of sculpture, stone cutting and power tools. I wanted to see, one, how women have always made things at home from my mother's experience, and also how that can be made in this larger thing called large sculpture. And large sculpture can be colorful, it can be soft, it can be delicate, it can have amazing amount of detail, which allows for the experience to see things tiny as well as big simultaneously without competing. That the idea of coexistence and proximity allows incredible breadth of intimacy for the viewer.
Mm-hmm. And the fact that it's not forbidding. It's not like a stone sculpture or
it doesn't have that kind of aura, which we call in the art world, aura and mystery of the genius, you know? And I think there's something lost in suggesting that should someone be talented in a specific way, or even a genius, that there's some loss in intimacy. So I really take pride in that tactile quality that my work has, because it's very handmade and because it's very visible what the objects I'm using are. They have not been dismantled, destroyed to become new fantastic objects. And as you can see, you can recognize both the art of making with the hand, as well as the objects that are simply placed as part of this conversation to become one sculpture, even though you see elements that are separate and can recognize what they are. A seashell remains a seashell. I didn't crush it. I didn't eliminate parts of it. I placed it. And I worked with it. So this is kind of a collaboration, the way I see it when I work with materials.
Yeah. No, there's a wonderful juxtaposition between that structure and those sensuous materials. I next wanted to ask you about your titles, because of course you have become known for these very long poetic titles. I was going to read one for the piece that you made for Art Basel in 2008. Was called,
Yeah, I remember.
it was called "In an Unnatural Storm, a World Fertile, Fragile, and Serious, polluted with excess pollination, hungry to seize an untidy commerce, also gave an unknowable size to some mongrel possessions, excreted a promiscuous heritage, sprayed her modern love, and breathed deeper than any other place, arcing her back through the new empire, the religion, bathed in unseasonable hope to alter what could not be warm." So I wanted to ask you, has poetry always played a role in your art making?
Well, I've really taken a lot of joy and responsibility to communicate my feelings for my own work and what I, at the moment, understand about what it is we're doing as human beings, you know? And so that's a huge responsibility. And it struck me that human beings love to mingle. And of course, at this time, it's very obvious. And they love to exchange. And it's a very serious kind of gesture that we have, the desire to walk in those two legs as far as we can and then come back to another place. And this kind of circulation or pollination, I really wanted to share in a more direct way. And I thought, while I feel like I'm doing it in the work to bring different cultures, products from different cultures, beads from different cultures, threads from different kinds of artisanal crafts and practices, I needed to say it directly. In a way, the text has been something we always understood as right in front of your face, that we are also suggesting we're literate, which is not true of the whole world. So I thought that using the text allows me to conjure up some of the subject matter that is preoccupying my thoughts and challenge my ambition for what we're going to share, because literally the art is about a subject that we all hold already dear to our hearts and to our ambition for the world. And so for me, the text is literal enough where you can precisely say, I have to share this thought, which is, in the beginning, when I was making this art, there were very cynical voices that would say, well, she's really doing what a self-taught artist would do, an outsider artist. She doesn't know what the subject is. She just likes fabric and materials. It's very decorative. So I heard these voices and I said, well, no, it's much more complicated than that. I'm thinking of this, I'm thinking of that. How do I reach? And so the text was really about my education and really sharing what that education means.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it certainly is part of the artwork in many ways. It's just another material for you, the way I read it. Yeah. Well, I think perhaps we want to go to Sita and what you have done. Shayna, if you want to pull up, there we go.
Beautiful.
This is how the atrium looks right now. As we left it, what seems now years ago, at the beginning of the pandemic, Rina resisted here with us in Jacksonville as long as we could. So it's not quite finished, but hopefully we will be able to finish it and present it to you in person soon. But Rina, do you want to tell us a little bit about your concept of the myth of Sita? And Yvonne, that will address your question that I saw you posted on the chat, how your idea of feminism or femininity has evolved in your work.
Yeah, I see the chat board and I see the question. So just to say a few words about this project, the atrium is an amazing space with its height and its light. And I felt I wanted to make something that allowed me to use the rise of this space towards the light. It allowed me to use color in a way that is hard to do when you have only artificial light. The floor is lit by this atrium light. I wanted to choose something, maybe you can share the title of this particular piece, which Irresistible Earth has been something that I've been thinking about, not only for our project, but for this year's work and maybe next year's work, because a lot of my materials are elements that come from the earth. They're natural materials that have been left behind. And so with this work, I use seashells that come from all over the world, and I use fabric that I've gotten from the fabric from the garment industry. And so this idea of commerce is invested in this work. The colors that I have chosen, this gold color, which is on Sita herself, the main figure, has those kinds of references to human culture that I think you can address through the dress, the covering that we wear. And she's also covered with the things that come out of nature itself. And there are vestiges of the synthetic, the man-made, human-made, crafted. All these things come together in the making of the work and the materials that make the sculpture. The three sculptures, her figure, and as you can see, she has these really long, extended arms that fall to beyond her, what would be her feet. And so the hands are addressed, and the hands are the hands that make things, that really continue to create. And so I brought a lot of attention to that. And she's a figure in the mythology that is considered exile. And she's an exile because she's not accepted as female into human society. And so in the story, she is brought to trial, and a circle of fire has to prove her innocence. And it's an innocence that is more about chastity in its interpretation of the mythology itself. And
which of course is universal.
Which is a universal story of women's belonging to human culture and their role in human culture, which is clearly linked to their ability to reproduce. And so this kind of proximity that is drawn in this mythology is about her being the seed and also the connection to the earth, that she represents inevitably are how much we are tied to nature, dependent, fragile. So the way this mythology of patriarchy is produced is this battle between nature. So she represents nature itself. Yeah. And as we continue to allow the sculptural element of Sita to develop, you will see those red threads that she's making with are going to be extended to the dome, which is on its adjacent side. The dome for me represents the earth, and it has this green mouth for that reason. What you see is on the round base of the dome, which is lying on its side. And this mouth, which is green, the green represent all that is green in the world on the surface of the earth.
Yeah, in the mythology, Mother Earth splits up and receives Sita as a form of liberation, right?
Yeah. To really save her, it seems, but save her from the circle of fire, which is threatening to destroy her, but also save her from exile. So if you can imagine, the larger home, which is the earth, opens up and says, but you do not need a home with this human culture. Your home is the earth. And so the mouth of the earth from the ground opens up, and as it's presented, it swallows her into this larger system. And so I have created a dome, which I use consistently in many of my large sculptures to represent different things. And this dome has this lip, which is the mouth, which is the green.
It is a recurrent motif in your work, the dome. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah,
its history?
Yeah, I started the dome with this pink Taj Mahal. And it's not a dominant part of the work, but it was a reference to this organic shape that is bodily. And, you know, for something that looks like a temple, a lot of architecture that has value importance in our city are dome shaped, Doma, for example, or the White House or a bank. So it's really had a significant place, and the dome is a round shape, which, you know, the word implies. And
it's also a womb.
Yeah, it's a womb. It echoes the head. All the round things are eyes, my glasses. And certainly this roundness, or the shape of round, is very much part of the universe as we imagine it. Because of the way gravity and the forces of nature shape the planets.
So here it's more architectural, but in other pieces, yeah, it becomes a more organic.
It can become, it is organic, it is the shape of the universe, it is the shape of our planet, it is the shape of many things on our planet. Are very important heads for sure. And then all these other things that protrude out of it in this particular piece, The World Lost, we have horns that stick out almost like appendages or an insect would. And so there is a lot of things that are layered, that are played into it, that are multiple entries into referencing nature. And definitely this onion shape is sometimes in this particular sculpture, World Lost, is upside down. It has these nuances of shape where the dome is elongated. In the pink Taj, it is more squat. And so you will see these kinds of vocabulary that I use to create different domes for different projects.
So going back to Project Atrium, although go back one, Shayna, that's one, yeah, which this you presented in Paris in 2011. Here, well, you say, what did it?
Yeah. So here, the dome is considered, as the title shares, the world as burnt fruit. It really is thinking about the possibility of the end of misuse of eating this fruit, which is a reference to the earth, ruining it before we eat it. The inevitability is that with any fruit, it has a ripeness that is the right time of eating. And to waste food is a very terrible thing. And so the world as burnt fruit, when I'm reading the title, when empires feuded for population and plantations, buried in colonial and ancient currency, our Garial appeared from an inky melon, which is the burnt fruit, hot with blossom, sprang forth to swallow the world, not yet whole, as burnt fruit. So there is this threat of...
And this way, we're not specifying an individual, organization, or corporation. It's just a donation, gift, or grant. And it has specified that it's...
what happened, Matthew? Do you know what happened here? Oh, okay, we're back. There was some crossover.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, oh yeah, and of course, for us in the West or a Christian, the fruit is also, you know, rationality, the knowledge, the apple, and so on.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of layers there.
Yeah, and I find, you know, I'm a big fan of Joseph Campbell's work, who is a writer and thinker who thinks about world culture and world religion.
Yeah, perhaps the first one.
Yeah. And so it came to my attention that a lot of these mythologies, as you were talking about, Ylva, about the fruit, is everywhere. This idea of offering fruit is a kind of human culture that is persistent and echoes throughout. So water and fruit have always had a place. Holy water, for example. One of the traditions of when a traveler comes to your door and asks for water, you are not allowed to deny water. You offer fruit. So I think for so many human beings, the idea of travel, migration, and offering fruit is about respecting the journey that we all take, and the sharing of the food on earth too, that our willingness to collaborate in the sharing as essential for our future.
Right.
And so even in a wedding ceremony, you have this idea when two people come together, there is a sharing of food in each other's mouths, that you feed each other. And I think a lot of the work will have in its title clear indicators about food for that reason.
Yeah.
And also, you know, the globe, as you can see in this particular piece, World as Burnt Fruit, you have the alligator, which has this long extended nose, which is the Asian alligator, which is extinct, I think, has a very darkened globe in its mouth.
Yeah.
And it comes out of this fruit. And in some sense, I was referencing how you feel when you open a pomegranate and the shock of seeing the inside so alive, I guess.
Yeah.
It still is a kind of experience about the skin of a fruit and the inside. A reminder that you've been given something that is so valuable that once was alive, that will give you nourishment and make you to continue to be alive. And so that kind of intimacy we have with the food,
Yeah.
that is
Universal.
part of our relationship here. Yeah.
Yeah, and Earth. So before opening to our Q&A, general Q&A, I had a bit full of philosophical question for you, which I think is very important to your work, because you are an artist that mines indiscriminately the resources of cultural symbolism. Visual cues, myths, histories. You use a lot of elements charged with significance from not only your own Indian culture, but from all other indigenous cultures. And I wanted you to speak a little bit to the potential and limitations of art as translator of cultural meaning. In other words, does hybridity constitute a loss of original meaning, a loss of purity, or is there even such a thing? Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I think hybridity and globalization, diaspora, authenticity, and ideas of translation and loss because of translation appear in a lot of our dialogues now as different cultures and different places in the world start to be aware of each other. And even within the same culture, this kind of division between the village and the city, the suburb and the city, as we experience now, there are a lot of fears of being swallowed up, if I may use that phrase, because I was using it about the earth swallowing us up. There is a lot of fears that come out of this kind of battle we think we need to have in order for us to grasp what we are, because what we are, we realize, is so large, so varied. And I think my faith in humanity is that we are all inevitably able to communicate, whether we're human or not human or plant. We do communicate. It's a given. And I guess I have a fundamental faith in that.
Trust.
Yeah, that seems to be an overwhelming visual experience that I've had since I was born, that this is true. And when you talk about truth, it's very important to realize that the project of finding truth that we so love to do remains an active one that's alive, that is always changing. And that it's not a static thing that we are. Even when we isolate that this is this culture and this is that culture, indifference. There are always connections we can make that are equally valuable to us in understanding both these cultures as separate, that the connections have to be also made to understand what is separate. What does it mean to be different? And I think that complex language that we get out of exploring that requires us to really give up the importance of authenticity or an essential culture that is innate to our biology. And I think that art allows us to realize that almost immediately we can relate to something visual, whether it's from our culture or not. And I think that happens because of this idea that we're predisposed to understanding everything that is natural. And man-made things, synthetic things, are from nature. We have to come to terms with the idea that even as we talk about authenticity and what is the origin of things and where are the boundaries of authenticity, we have to realize that connections sometimes tell us more than the kind of model of authenticity allows. And in terms of my materials, I always use synthetic materials alongside natural ones. And coming back to being an engineer, I mean, my area was material science, and all things synthetic come out of nature. They're not only man-made, they're made by nature. And
right, we are part of nature.
Yeah, especially with the oil crisis. I mean, I have lots of friends who are vegan and are rejecting using natural products, but at the same time, because they don't want animals to be killed, but they're using products that are made out of oil industry, petroleum. And those
which ultimately is animal. Yeah, it's a conundrum.
All of
it's
it
a conundrum.
is connected, as you see. And
yeah.
so making boundaries and taboos of not mixing doesn't really allow us to enter into the dialogue of what is real, what is true. Is it that we're looking at? So I'm always interested in the whole picture. I'm not interested in dismantling a culture as not authentic or targeting people and saying you don't belong to this culture because you do things this way. I don't see the value in that. I think policing culture through authenticity is very problematic. It's one thing to celebrate a culture because it has all these elements, a list of things, but you'll always find a list of things that also that culture has that connects it to another culture.
Yeah, and that you can see yourself in other places in the world in different ways. Well, thank you, Rina. I'd like to open it up to questions. Either, like Matthew said, through chat, or just raise your hand or speak out.
So there was one question in the chat.
Yeah, I think that was yours, Yvonne. Do you want to say it?
Sure, thank you. While I was listening to you in regards to how you were reflecting to your history, your personal history as an artist, and also how the world has been changing as we're moving forward, I wanted to see if you yourself have seen your development in the expression of what it is to be a woman, as in womanhood and femininity. I see all of that as in the current pieces, but I was wondering if there had been a marked shift because there has been a cultural, but as well as an awareness, but also a rebirth of womanhood in our world. So I was wondering if your pieces were speaking of other issues at that time, or have you always kept it as part of the core of your expression? And because I see it as an absolute celebration in your current work. Right? So
I think that it's a very important question that I ask myself always. Realizing that a lot of the figurative work are actually female. I think there has always been a lot of shame and shadow over being female in many cultures. And I think that now the world is much more public about the things that women have felt shamed by. And even now, as we
being made to feel shame.
Shamed by, yeah. I'm really taking a lot of joy and celebration in knowing that we can share with everyone, other women as well as other cultures, with men, who we are biologically and what we experience. I mean, to give a small sampling of how it felt to be a girl when I was a child, I remember boys would be, no problem, I have to go to the bathroom right now. Girls would feel afraid to ask to go to the bathroom. And at 5, I remember raising my hand. I was in London and wanting to go to the bathroom, and the teacher said, "You're not pronouncing the words correctly," that insisting I had an accent, but actually I only learned English the same time. And so I wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom. And I saw and grew up with this idea of punishment for the body in the West, and containment and restrictions and responsibility, as if the female body is such a burden to culture. And even during this time, during the virus, we have the energy to really implement rules about abortion, for example, in our country, that we can't allow abortions in specific states during the coronavirus. We always talk about how women are dressed improperly, how they act improperly, and what other burdens they must carry because of who they are biologically. And I think that we have to recall that all of us, whether women or men, are very fragile and vulnerable biologically. And our strength is in our sharing. And that means public sharing really brings us together as a unified animal, you know? And I think that these ideas of women being really a lesser animal comes through in my work and references women's bodies throughout. And I think that even the circularity of shapes and the volume created out of spheres and vessels that I use to create sculpture has this kind of references to the interior of women's body, which is a reference to their sexuality. And
yeah, I've found it interesting in some reading about your work. There have been people, critics, men mostly, of course, who have misunderstood that female sexual element with eroticism.
yeah, I think it's really interesting that women have really participated in, I think, a very dominant articulation of who they are in terms of their sexuality, and are now reached a point where they can talk about their sexuality. But I find that we are not able to talk about a more fundamental thing, which is basically love. That is the hardest thing in my dialogue with men to talk about. They're all for talking about your sexuality and you being open to being sexual as females. But when it comes to love, I think there's so much that is, you know, kind of taboo to
Absolutely.
reference.
Or that we don't even have the vocabulary for it.
We don't know, we're very clumsy, and yet,
We're very clumsy.
oh my goodness, all these movies and songs are written about love. And we all want that. And we're missing it right now with the virus, because some of that has to do with seeing and being around other people, animals, plants, trees. We get something called love that impacts our brain, that wants us to survive and live. It's a survival instinct that is very precious. There's no point in having a reproductive ability if you don't want to live.
Or love.
You will not want to live if you don't feel loved,
Yeah.
right? And so when we talk about new ideas that were taboo, like depression, poverty, we're really talking about, do we love enough? You know? And I think that's really essential to your question. What is the relationship that we've developed now to womanhood and femininity? And what is it that we need to talk about as women in talking and participating in the conversation? Yeah. What is our world? What are our lives about if it's not that? You know?
Thank you, Rina.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any other question for Rina?
Guys, remember, you're welcome to type your questions into the chat box if you can see that, or there's a reactions tab down at the bottom. If you want to click that, it'll show you or show us that you have your hand up, particularly for those who aren't showing their screen at the moment. And if we can see you, you can just obviously put your hand up as well. Looks like Christopher's got a question, so I'm going to unmute you, Christopher. Hang on just a second. Oh, we can't hear you just yet. Hold on. Oh.
That was a thumbs up. It wasn't a question. I was just.
Oh, I got you.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Christopher.
Yeah. Well, I'll step in here. One of the things I'm attracted to in your artwork is the fact that you have this there's this exquisite beauty of the materials and of the shapes somewhat and all right, but at the same time they're well, look at Hanuman, he's scary, and they're
he's so cute.
I love Holland Carter, the critic of the New York Times. He called once your work, he described it as having a creepy, spoiled, mutant beauty, both attractive and unsavory. That there is an attraction repulsion kind of thing, which in a way is what we have with nature. Nature has that. It can be attractive, but it can also be repulsive, and it's also how we experience ourselves as nature, as bodies. Our bodies also have this attraction repulsive mixture there. And I'm fascinated by that element in your work.
So, you know, it's interesting because I've always been, as you said, fascinated with the interaction between beauty and what would be monstrous, you know. And I often felt kind of attracted to the story of Frankenstein, which allows you to think about both the beauty of creation, making something come alive, right? Which is exciting and beautiful. And at the same time, the kind of remorse or fear of what it is that you've made.
Created.
So making art allows me to like consider that whole narrative that Mary Shelley wrote about so many, many years ago about birth itself. When you make something, if you can apply it to making art. I wanted to make something that really talks about our willingness to take risk and invite danger when we travel. There is an element of excitement or newfound beauty that we anticipate and will experience, and at the same time, the risk that you take upon yourself. And I felt this kind of reach that we have where we're compelled to leave where we're born. So many of us do not live where we were born.
More and more.
And has those kinds of conversations about what is monstrous and threatens us, which is, you know, for me, a definition, but also what is like significantly ugly. And I think a lot of attraction, human attraction between each other, whether it's friendship or, you know, more romantic, as we say, has this element that keeps you drawn together, which is both dangerous and beautiful.
Yeah.
And it certainly is the dialogue that has enabled us to think of women and also foreigners and the exotic, what is taboo and how it confronts us, what is taboo. And even so, in this situation, how I'm also hearing people talk about the virus as if it's an organism, as a monster.
Yes, it has very much to do
Yeah,
with
as a monster that has invaded our world. And we have to learn how it has invaded our world in so many ways. It's not only invaded our body, but it's managed to reinvent how we operate economically and socially.
Yeah,
And
as a
so,
species, because
yeah,
it's global.
it is right now the biggest trespasser known for a long time. You know, the epidemic or the pandemic, it is the foreigner in the global sense to all of us. And as a foreigner, I'm very intrigued by this relationship we have with adjusting to something new that has really turned our world upside down, which is the threat of the foreign, I think, and our perception of how we deal with disease. We can't really ever forget that disease is always going to be global now. It's always has been global, but I think with our newfound freedom of circulation,
and mobility.
we have to like consider that there's great responsibilities that come with our freedom.
Well, I think unless someone has another question for Rina, I think that is a very good place to leave it.
Thank you.
And I thank you. Yeah, first of all, thank you, Rina, for joining us and for giving us this beautiful installation.
Thank you for inviting me to participate and to have this conversation during this very difficult time.
Yeah.
It's so important to have had this opportunity to be with you, even in distance.
Yeah, thank you, Rina. And thank you to all of our members. Thank you so much for tuning in. And please keep safe and have a wonderful weekend from all of us here at MOCA. A virtual hug to everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.